Hello there, my name is Annette with Sunbeam FPP and Sunbeam Fabric Art. Today I'm going to walk you through how I tested out my pattern for this lovely bird called a yellow-bellied sapsucker. The test was successful, and you will find a link to the Etsy pattern down below in the details of this video. I divided the pattern up into 3 parts. Part 1 is the top right, Part 2 is the lower right, and then Part 3 is the left side. Many of my patterns have tiny pieces. This pattern is no exception. On section A, which is the top of the eye, I've got a gray, a black, a white, and a gray right there together, and I put the numbers outside the allowance because I just couldn't fit it in those little boxes. Let's talk about the fabrics that I chose for this pattern. I was looking for a fabric to use for the yellow belly part, and first I looked at this batik that had kind of a yellowish sheen to it, which reminded me of the actual bird, but it didn't end up working out. I've got this green batik on the left for my background. I've got this interesting cork fabric for the tree that the bird is on. I've got this little red batik here for the head and the throat. I only need one little piece of yellow, so I went to my scrap drawer and got out that square. I do need some white. And then the 3 grays I picked was a light gray batik for the yellow belly part, a medium gray pattern for the back, and a plain gray for the head and eye and claw gray parts. I also need a black. There is one pattern piece in this pattern that overlaps 2 pages, and EQ8, which is the program I use, it does print a joining line, and what I like to do is cut a serpentine or a zigzag line, and then I can put one piece right on top of the other and see exactly how to match them up. Then I pop a little piece of tape on there to hold them together. Next, I cut apart all the sections, and in this case, I've got A through W. A lot of my patterns have various shades of one color. For example, I've got 3 shades of gray for this bird pattern that I'm going to use. Plus, I have black for some parts of the bird, and those tend to look alike when the pattern is printed out, so I like to go through and jot down notes to myself. The red, the green, and the yellow are super easy to identify on the printed pattern, but for the rest of it, it's a little hard. Once I have all the sections cut apart, I go through my fabric and I start cutting out individual pieces for each section. I like to go through the whole pattern and cut out all the pieces in advance. Using section A as an example, piece 1 is gray, plain gray. Piece 2 is black. Piece 3 is white. That's the highlight of the eye. And piece 4 is that plain gray again. Next, piece 5 and 6 are both white. And last, piece 7 is black. Next, I like to flip the entire stack over, so piece 1 is on top, and then I put the pattern piece right on top of the fabric stack. I will go through all the sections like this, cut out each individual piece for the section, and stack them up so I can sit down at the sewing machine and do all the sections without having to stop and cut more fabric. Here's a look at section B, which is the bottom part of the eye. We've got black, gray, gray, and black, and that should complete section B. I'm going to speed through some of cutting. There are a couple of things I want to point out during this process, and I will slow down for those. One of the hardest things for me to get used to when I learned how to paper piece was that the fabric is wrong side up when you're looking at the pattern piece, and that is the size you need to measure to with the fabric wrong side up. The second hardest thing for me to figure out was angles. Sometimes I will just eyeball the angle and trim the fabric so that I know exactly where that angle goes so that it will cover the actual piece that I'm trying to cover. Sometimes I will fold the fabric on that angle line and then trim a 1/4 of an inch away so I have my seam allowance. If it's a very small piece with an angle, I will just cut the fabric twice as big as I need. Any small cutoffs I kept handy in case I needed another piece, but for the most part I folded up all the excess fabric and put it back in my stash where it goes. My paper piecing setup, I have my pressing mat right nearby with a dry iron. I don't use steam, and I only use a spray when the block is complete. You can't see it here, but I also have the pattern taped up in front of my face where I can see it in front of my sewing machine. I'm going to start with a slow assembly of one of my sections. It's got 5 pieces. I'm going to start with 1 and 2. I cut away some of the excess paper here, which makes assembly a little bit easier. Piece 1 and 2 here have angles, pretty steep angles at that, so it's going to be a little bit on the tricky side to get those right sides together on the back of the paper and stitch on the line. As I turn this around, what I'm looking for is to make sure that the sew line between piece 1 and 2 is overhung by the fabric. In other words, I've got enough for a seam allowance over there. When I stitch these together and I flip open piece 2, I want to make sure I've got plenty of room and that my piece is covered. The paper I'm using here is just recycled office paper, and I'm using a stitch length of 1.3 to get myself a nice perforation. I also want to stitch a couple of stitches before and a couple of stitches after the actual division line. When I flip the fabric open, I can see that piece number 2 is going to cover where piece number 2 shows on the pattern. I'm going to trim away excess threads. I'm going to fold the paper back on that line I just stitched, trim away excess bulk, if there is any, from the seam. Then I can press that seam open and get ready to add piece 3. For this piece number 3, I'm going to make sure that when I flip it over to the back, it's going to overlap the stitch line between 1 and 2 and the addition of 3. I can fold down that paper and see that it does overlap my stitch line. Again, I'm going to trim away excess thread, fold the paper on the line I just stitched, trim away the excess bulk, and press that fabric open. piece number 4 I cut big enough so I really don't have to worry about the angle too much. I'm making sure I place it right sides together with the pieces 1, 2, and 3. Make sure when I fold that down, I am covering up the seam allowance. I again stitch that seam, snip the threads, trim away excess bulk, and then press that seam open. The last piece for this section is a triangle shape. I'm going to make sure that's big enough to cover, and you can see when I'm checking the size, I've got the fabric wrong side up. When I flip it to the back, I've got the right side up, right sides together with what's already on the back. I'm making sure my seam is going to be covered. Then I can stitch the seam, trim away the excess thread, trim away the excess bulk from the seam, and press the fabric open. And this little section will just need to be trimmed on the dotted line, and that goes into the pattern. It's the bottom of the tree where the bird's feathers overlap the tree trunk. There's almost always an oops for me when I'm putting a pattern together. In this case, I thought that color for that last triangle was white, and it wasn't. That was part of the yellow belly. There are 2 pieces that I needed that different fabric of the lightest gray, and this was one of those. And I didn't have a scrap of that, so I had to go back to my stash, grab that same fabric, cut off another triangle, pick out that seam, and replace it with a new triangle. Luckily for me, that piece was the last one of the section, so I didn't have to start over from scratch. If that had been a piece right in the middle of the section, I probably just would have reprinted that page of the pattern and started over. I thought I'd pause on the 2 eye sections, which are A and B of this pattern, and talk about matching. So you can see this one just is black with the 1 gray shade going around the pupil. Here's what that section B looks like after I stitched all the pieces. You can see it's black with that gray line going through, which is around the eye. Here is piece A, which is the top of the eye section. So we need a little black, a little gray, and a couple of pieces of white. There's a pupil highlight of white, and then the actual feathers of the bird around the eye are also white in places. Those first 4 pieces of section A are so tiny, but it's fun to have a challenge, and the detailed results are awesome. If you don't feel like this tiny of a piece is something you want to do, you can always print out your pattern at a larger percent and make it bigger to start with. I'm going to be trimming the rest of the pieces in a bit, but I wanted to go ahead and trim piece A and piece B so you could kind of see how that eye fits together. You can see that a lot of the tinier pieces have little notches on corners, not all the corners, but some of the corners. That really helps out when putting 2 seams together. It helps with the matching up. So let's take a look at how these two pieces of the eye will go together. I've got my picture of the bird handy for a reference guide and making sure those two are going together the right way. Then I will use clips and clip on the stitch line. Once I get it lined up exactly where I want it, I can go ahead and stitch that seam with my 1.3 stitch length. I'm still using 1.3 if there is still paper attached. Now I want to talk about trimming these large pieces or ones that are just one piece of fabric for the pattern. What I will do is I will make sure my wrong side's up and my pattern piece is on top, and I will tape around the edges of the pattern piece. Next, I'll line up my ruler on the sew line at 1/4 of an inch, and that way my cutting edge is over the dotted line, which is the seam allowance. While I'm trimming, I'm looking for any cutoffs that are more than an inch in width, and I will save those into my scrap bin. For smaller pieces like this one, I just use my scissors to trim. Once all the sections are trimmed up, it's time to start assembly according to my instructions. Now you saw I already put sections A and B together. I'm going to go ahead and remove the paper from those two, and then I will start adding more sections. It probably won't be a surprise to you, but I love putting puzzles together, and sometimes a foundation paper pieced pattern is just like a puzzle. For large, simple paper piece patterns, you really don't have to remove the paper like this, but for these tiny, tiny pieces in tiny sections, it really is easier for me to remove this paper as I go. One thing to note is that there is lots of stretch in foundation paper piecing. There are lots of angles. There's no cutting on the grain. You're cutting triangles and odd angles. So lots and lots of stretch will be happening. My strategy is to just keep this in mind as I remove paper, keep it in mind as I press open, and try not to get anything out of place. I'm very gentle as I remove the paper. It may not look like it, but I am very gentle without tugging on the fabric. So I stitched that next line, adding the third piece, the third section to what is eventually going to be my woodpecker. And you can see that line wasn't exactly straight, but it's okay. And we can see the eye with that pupil highlight there, and it's going to look amazing. And I'm following my test instructions that I wrote by the sections to see which piece goes next. And again, like a puzzle, I have to figure out which side of this little triangle does this piece of fabric go to. Here's a look at it after I added that next piece, and now I'm going to stitch on another piece. With this piece, we're talking about why the clips are important. I'm going to go ahead and clip where the back of this woodpecker's head comes together. I want to make sure that lines up nicely, so that's why I'm using these clips to keep everything together till I get to the sewing machine. And again, you know, this line isn't exactly straight, but overall it's going to be just fine, and the back of that woodpecker's head matches up just right. After the addition of each section, I am gently pressing open. I also wanted to point out in my instructions, you can see this F and G has a parenthesis around that section. So before I add F and G to the mix, I need to stitch them together first and then add them. Here you can see I'm picking out that seam because I did not like the way it was lining up, so I went back and stitched it again. I also wanted to note, after I removed the paper, I changed the stitch length to at least 2.2. Here's a look at part 1, and we've got 2 more parts to go to finish this bird. Here's another big oops, but easy to fix. When I cut out piece W, it should have been green. Instead, I've cut it out of the same fabric as the tree. I want that to be green, so this is an easy fix. I'm just going to rip out that one seam. I'm going to cut out an oversized piece of the green, have one straight edge, and worry about trimming down the other 3 sides after I trim down the block, because this is actually the very last piece for the entire block. You can see that was indeed an easy fix. And now with parts 1, 2, and 3 all together, I'm going to go ahead and press it flat again, gently, maybe with a little steam, and then trim this block. Here's a great look at this bird. I love the way it turned out. This yellow-bellied sapsucker is a great bird. I don't get to see them that often. We have other woodpeckers that are more common in Missouri, but occasionally, if you look hard out in the woods, you will find these beautiful birds. If you get out to the West Coast, you will find not a yellow-bellied sapsucker, but you will find a red-naped sapsucker. So maybe I'll add that to my bird piecing plans. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment to help me grow this little foundation paper piece channel. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again next time.